The post-war victory of corporate propaganda. During the McCarthy period, business first beat back the unions with the Taft-Hartley Act, and then secured a shift to conservatism in American politics similar to the shift which followed its campaigns of 1919-1920. In December 1945, the NAM summarized its use of newspapers and radio during 1945.
Every day, one or more news stories about the National Association of Manufacturers appears in newspapers in some part of the country, and often in all newspapers in all parts of the country. On the airwaves this year, NAM members, officers, and committees spoke directly with the public for a total of 1,350 hours of time, or 56 full 24-hour days. Their words reached into the homes of Americans and into the barracks of Americans stationed in all parts of the world.
By 1946, the NAM was only one of a great number of business-sponsored organizations that were cooperating to drench the country with anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-union, and anti-New Deal propaganda.
When will the plain, ordinary, sincere, yet sheep-like people of America awaken to the fact that their common affairs are being arranged and run for them by aliens, communists, crackpot refugees, renegades, socialist termites, and traitors? If you, the American people, don't get busy and fight, this whole vicious plot will be slipped over on you without your knowing what hit you. What's wrong? I'll tell you what's wrong. We have robbed man of his liberty. We have taught the American businessman until he is afraid to sign his name to a paycheck for the fear he is violating some bureaucratic rule that will call for the surrender of a bond, the appearance before a committee, or even imprisonment itself. We are going to take the government out of the hands of these city slickers and give it back to the people that still believe that 2 and 2 is 4.
The United States Chamber of Commerce was one such organization. Their annual report summarizes one very specific part of its activities during 1946-47, the distribution of large pamphlets of some 50 pages each.
1946. More than 1 million copies of the Chamber pamphlet Communist Infiltration in the United States were distributed and received with shocked surprise in many quarters. 1947. Communists Within the Government, a Chamber publication, brought screams of anguish not only from known communists but from others. A cabinet officer sought its withdrawal. However, the government's loyalty program, inadequate but still a loyalty program, was begun.
Many of the country's largest firms, Fortune magazine observed in 1950, have started extensive programs to indoctrinate employees. The American Advertising Council represents large corporations and large advertising agencies. In April 1947, the Council announced a $100 million advertising program which, over the next 12 months, would use all media to sell the American economic system to the American people. The program was officially described as a major project of educating the American people about the economic facts of life. Daniel Bell, then an editor of Fortune, provides a perspective on both the scale and the anti-union and anti-New Deal purposes of these campaigns.
It has been industry's prime concern in the post-war years to change the climate of opinion ushered in by the Depression. This free enterprise campaign has two essential aims: to re-win the loyalty of the worker which now goes to the union, and to halt creeping socialism. In short, the campaign has had the definite aim of seeking to shift the Democratic majority of the last 20 years into the Republican camp. The output is staggering. By all odds, it adds up to the most intensive sales campaign in the history of industry.
American businesses, pre- and post-war assaults on public opinion, had a double objective: to turn the public against the Democratic administration of Roosevelt and Truman and their liberal supporters, and to turn it against the growing power of the trade union movement that resulted from the Wagner Act of 1935. The first objective was achieved with the McCarthy period and the election of Eisenhower in 1952.
Dwight D. Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States.
We must be ready to dare all for our country. For history does not long entrust the care of freedom to the weak or the timid. A people that values its privileges above its principles soon loses both.
During World War II, business made unprecedented profits while wages remained controlled. When the war ended, business had, in addition to its long-term objective of weakening the union movement, two immediate concerns: to minimize wage rises and maximize price rises. At the 1946 elections, labor problems was one of the chief political issues on which the Republicans won control of Congress. The NAM took the initiative and drafted a new labor law and arranged for its submission to the new Congress. The Taft-Hartley Act, passed in 1947, embodied the NAM's proposals completely, except for a ban on industry-wide bargaining. Not surprisingly, it placed tremendous obstacles in the way of the new organization of workers. Public opinion, however muddled, did no longer support the unions. It was the force which backed the new curbs on unions enacted in the post-war years. The General Motors strikes, like most of the other important strikes in the 1945-46 upsurge, were fought not on the picket line, but in Washington and in the press and over the radio. The outcome was that while unions won the strikes, business won the public relations battle, with the Taft-Hartley Act as its prize. Apart from years affected by the Korean War, the American labor movement was never again able to increase the low proportion of the workforce it had organized. 30 years later, in the face of a renewed propaganda and public relations onslaught by business in the 1970s, organized labor in the United States went into a steep and possibly terminal decline. By the end of 1946, the business campaigns have paid off. Public opinion condemned the strikes of 1945-46. Unions came off with worse public relations than companies. A survey shows that the public thought that companies had higher regard for the public interest than the unions, and even union members were now less favorably disposed towards their own unions. The public now associated unions with mass picketing and violence, although there was no violence in the strikes of the past years. The midterm elections of 1946 marked labor's worst defeat since Hoover's day, a truly amazing victory for corporate public relations. Alex Carey then goes on to describe the 50s as an era where corporations tried to find ways to replace the unions. The Wagner Act had made it illegal to use company unions as a way of preempting unions, so the companies had to search for other avenues. This search became officially known as the Human Relations Movement. It embraced such notions as employee participation, employee communication, and democratic decision-making. Sounds familiar? Vast amounts of money all of a sudden became available for the study of human relations in industry. Peter Drucker, doyen of American management consultants, said in 1950, with amazing frankness, that, quote, "Most of us in management have instituted human relations as a way of busting the unions." That trend continued through the 50s. Looking back at that decade, Professor Robert Dahl of Columbia finds very little difference between democracy and totalitarianism.
If political preferences are simply plugged into the system by leaders, business or other, in order to extract what they want from the system, then the model of electoral democracy is substantially equivalent to the model of totalitarian rule.